On a cold, misty Sunday morning, no one at North Weald Airfield knew history was only hours away. The sun still hid behind the fog stretching across the Essex countryside, and the air smelled of last night's disinfectant from the washblock. Sergeant Pilot Ray Holmes, age 26, woke in the same metal bed he'd been using since joining 504 Squadron 3 weeks earlier. He had learned to fly in Tiger Moths back in civilian life, and had already seen more combat than most men ever would. The date was Sunday, September 15, 1940, later remembered as Battle of Britain Day. And before noon, Holmes would make a decision so extreme that it became legend. He would ram his Hurricane into a German bomber over London. Yet that morning felt ordinary. He had flown a quiet patrol the day before, and the squadron board showed another routine sweep later that morning. London, however, was burning night after night. Since September 7th, the Luftwaffe had shifted its fury from RAF airfields to the capital. The change gave fighter command time to repair runways and replace lost aircraft, but it turned London into a fire-lit battlefield. Dock workers slept in underground stations. Fire crews pulled children from wrecked buildings at dawn. And every morning, pilots like Holmes took off knowing the Germans would come again. The scramble. At about 11:15, the telephone rang in the operations room. A WAAF runner bolted across the dispersal shouting coordinates. Pilots dropped newspapers and scrambled for their aircraft. Holmes tugged on his Mae West life jacket, checked his parachute straps, and sprinted toward Hurricane MKIP 3358. His rigger had already primed the Merlin engine. It coughed twice, then thundered to life. Across the field, 11 more Hurricanes roared awake. Squadron leader Ian Gleed would lead them southeast toward the Thames estuary, where radar spotted a massive formation rising from France. Holmes knew his Hurricane well. It wasn't as sleek as the Spitfire, heavier, slower in turns, but tough, built of steel tubing covered with fabric. It could take punishment and still make it home. Its 8 Browning .303s carried about 300 rounds each, barely 15 seconds of total firing time. Veterans fired in short bursts. New pilots held the trigger too long and hit nothing. Holmes had already learned the lesson the hard way. The enemy approaches. The squadron climbed in tight formations. Below them, Essex fields faded into the grey sprawl of London. The Thames gleamed like a strip of metal. Holmes scanned the sky behind and above. Every trainee was taught that your survival depended on watching your six. The Luftwaffe usually attacked in stacked layers. Bombers at 15,000 feet, close escort fighters just above them, and free Hunter Bf 109s even higher, waiting to strike RAF fighters chasing the bombers. At 11:40, a voice on the radio called, "Tally-ho! Contacts!" Holmes looked up and froze. The southern horizon was alive with movement. Dozens, maybe 100 German bombers, Dorniers, Heinkels, perhaps even Ju-88s, advanced in perfect V-shaped formations. Above them, escorts glittered in the sun. This was no probe. This was an attempted knockout blow. For 2 brutal months, the Luftwaffe had tried to crush fighter command. By mid-September, the entire future of the war depended on whether the RAF could hold the line. The road to this moment. Reichsmarschall Göring had promised Hitler air superiority by early September, essential for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of southern England. Troops and barges crowded the French coast, but the weather window was closing fast. Earlier Luftwaffe strategy had failed. Radar stations repaired too quickly. Forward airfields turned out to be decoys. Sector stations were badly damaged, but not destroyed. Fighter command was exhausted, losing pilots faster than they could be trained. Then came the turning point. On August 24th, a German bomber accidentally dropped its load on central London. Churchill immediately retaliated by sending Bomber Command to strike Berlin. The raid caused little damage but enormous rage. Hitler vowed to destroy British cities in return. Göring shifted his entire strategy toward bombing London. The first major daylight attack on September 7th hit the East End with 300 bombers and 600 fighters, killing over 400 civilians. But while London burned, Fighter Command's crucial airfields were finally recovering. By September 15th, Göring believed Britain was on its last legs. Luftwaffe intelligence claimed the RAF had fewer than 100 serviceable fighters left. The real number was closer to 700, a catastrophic German miscalculation. That Sunday, Göring planned 2 massive raids, one in late morning and one in the afternoon. His goal was simple: destroy whatever the RAF had left, break fighter command, and end the battle once and for all. And Holmes, climbing steadily toward the Thames, was flying straight into the opening moments of that decisive clash. And now, with the German formation breaking apart above the city, the outcome of the entire day hung in the balance. If the Luftwaffe succeeded here, Operation Sea Lion could begin within a week. If they failed, Hitler's invasion plans would collapse. Everything depended on the next few hours. Radar operators and the chain home network had already tracked 2 massive waves crossing the French coast. The first wave, around 100 Dornier 17 bombers with more than 100 Messerschmitt fighters, was aimed straight at London's docks and the city's morale. The second wave would follow close behind, exploiting whatever chaos the first created. But 11 Group's commander, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, had already scrambled every available squadron. Reinforcements from 12 Group were rushing south. By the time the Germans reached Kent, more than 200 RAF fighters were climbing to intercept, the largest British force assembled in a single battle so far. Ray Holmes knew none of this. All he saw were more enemy bombers than he had ever faced. His job was simple: stop them from reaching central London. Within minutes, the sky over South London turned into a tangled storm of aircraft. Hurricanes and Spitfires dropped out of the sun, attacking from every angle. German formations that had looked perfect over France now broke apart under the pressure. Bombers panicked, dumping their loads early across South London suburbs, far from the docks they were meant to hit. Holmes and 504 Squadron dived into the fight from 16,000 feet. He went after a group of separated Dornier 17s, the slim, fast, flying pencil bombers that carried a crew of 4 and several light machine guns. Against fighters, their defensive fire could be deadly, especially from the rear gunner. Holmes first struck a damaged Dornier, firing short, trained bursts. His bullets stitched across the bomber's wing root and fuselage. The rear gunner fired back, but the rounds went wide. Holmes broke away, climbed, and attacked again, another Dornier, this one intact. His burst set one engine ablaze, sending the bomber rolling away toward the Thames. By now, the fight had become chaos. Radio calls overlapped. Pilots shouted warnings, called out enemies, or announced they were bailing out. VHF radios couldn't maintain order across a battle stretching 50 square miles. Squadrons splintered into pairs, then lone aircraft fighting on instinct. Climbing again, Holmes spotted a single Dornier heading northwest, straight toward central London. Its bomb bay doors were closed. It hadn't released its payload. No other RAF fighters were in sight. If it reached Buckingham Palace, the propaganda impact would be devastating. Holmes dropped into pursuit. He opened fire at 400 yards, then 300, then closer, tracer streaking across the Dornier's wings and tail. But the bomber kept flying, steady and determined. He fired again. Then the guns fell silent. He was out of ammunition. The Dornier continued toward Westminster, only minutes from the palace. Holmes instantly understood what that meant. A single bomb on the palace would be a global headline. The King and Queen had refused to leave London. Churchill used their courage to rally the public. A hit there would hand Germany a victory far larger than physical damage. It would shake British morale at its core. Holmes had seconds to act. With no ammunition and no other fighters nearby, there was no standard tactic left. Flying alongside and hoping to scare the pilot wouldn't work. German crews had survived far worse. Then the idea struck, sudden and absolute. He would ram the bomber. Not head-on, that would be certain death. Instead, he would strike the tail, the Dornier's most fragile structure. Light aluminum ribs, fabric covering, strong enough for flight, but not for impact. If he could shear off the tail, the bomber would lose control and fall before reaching its target. And he might have just enough time to bail out. It wasn't a trained maneuver. The RAF didn't teach ramming, it cost too many pilots. But this was the only chance. He lined up behind the Dornier, adjusting his angle of attack. The bomber filled his windscreen, the gunner, the glazed nose, the black Bokenkreuz marking. His Hurricane passed 300 miles per hour. The closing speed neared 500 miles per hour. He had one shot, and only one. Holmes aimed directly for the tail. And committed. Holmes had already chosen his strike point, the junction where the Dornier's vertical and horizontal stabilizers met, the structural core of the tail. He angled his Hurricane's port wing toward it, knowing he would likely lose several meters of wing and much of his control, but it was the only way to guarantee the bomber would never reach central London. The Hurricane's wing structure was famously tough, built around deep spars and a reinforced leading edge. If he hit cleanly, it might slice through the Dornier's tail before the shock reached his own fuselage. Or the wing could tear away entirely, sending fuel spilling from ruptured tanks and leaving him with barely seconds to escape. Holmes understood the risks, but he was past the point of hesitation. The Dornier was less than 200 yards ahead now, dropping slightly as it neared the government buildings around Whitehall. Holmes caught glimpses of the Thames curving south, the grey outline of Parliament, the green sweep of St. James's Park, and the distant shape of Buckingham Palace. If the bomber held its course, it would pass over the palace within a minute. He made a final fine adjustment. The Dornier's tail filled his windscreen. He saw fabric trembling in the slipstream, the painted emblem on the fin, and the rear gunner turning his weapon directly toward him. Tracer rounds flicked past, but Holmes held steady. The collision happened at about 11:53 a.m. on September 15, 1940, over the Victoria area. The Hurricane's port wing struck the Dornier's tail with a tremendous clang. The stabilizer tore away at once, spinning off in fragments. Holmes's wing folded back from the impact, its main spar failing. Fuel streamed outward. Both aircraft jolted apart, the Dornier dropping into an uncontrollable spin, Holmes's fighter rolling violently as it lost lift on one side. Holmes tried to counter the roll, but the aircraft barely responded. The altimeter needle spun downward, 13,000 feet. 12,000. 11,000. He had maybe a minute before impact. Warning lights flashed as the Merlin engine oversped, but Holmes focused on one task: getting out. He forced the canopy open against the wind, released his harness, and pushed himself upward. Fighting the G-forces of the spinning aircraft, he managed to pull free. The slipstream caught him instantly, and he fell clear of the Hurricane at roughly 9,000 feet. Below him, London stretched out in a patchwork of streets, parks, and smoke from earlier raids. After a few seconds of tumbling, his hand found the parachute ripcord. The pilot chute popped, the main canopy followed, and the sudden jerk slowed his fall to a safe descent. He hung beneath the silk canopy, shaken but alive, drifting toward the area around Victoria Station. People in the streets below had heard the engines and gunfire and were now staring upward as he descended. In the distance rose a dark column of smoke, the Dornier's crash, though Holmes couldn't see the exact spot. His own Hurricane had come down elsewhere, later reported to have destroyed a small shop in Chelsea. Remarkably, no one on the ground had been hurt. Holmes tried to steer toward open space, but the early war parachutes had little control. The wind carried him over rooftops, barely clearing a chimney line, before he dropped into a narrow garden behind a terrace house in Pimlico. He hit the ground hard but intact, the white canopy collapsing over a cluster of plants and hedges. Dazed, he freed himself from the harness. A middle-aged woman hurried out from the back door, flour still on her apron. Seeing the RAF uniform, she vanished inside and returned with a cup of tea, an act so calm and ordinary amid the chaos that Holmes nearly laughed. He thanked her and drank, the sweetness and heat steadying his hands. Wardens and police arrived within minutes, having tracked his descent. They checked him over and arranged transport back to Nordholt. By the time he returned, reports were coming in. The Luftwaffe had suffered heavy losses, over 60 aircraft down, while RAF losses were far fewer. Crucially, the bomber formations had been broken before reaching key targets. The docks and Buckingham Palace were unharmed. The Dornier Holmes had struck had crashed near Victoria Station, its bomb load exploding and damaging nearby streets, though sparing the palace. Debris from Holmes's Hurricane had destroyed a tobacconist's shop, turning it into a minor sightseeing spot as Londoners collected small metal fragments as mementos. Newspapers published photos of the wreckage: twisted metal, broken spars, scattered bricks. Within days, the government highlighted Holmes's desperate ramming attack in speeches and papers. Churchill, monitoring the battle from Chequers, immediately recognized how the story would symbolize Britain's refusal to break. And as that chapter of the fight faded, the next began with a reaction in London. News that a Hurricane pilot had deliberately brought down a bomber headed toward Buckingham Palace spread quickly. When Churchill was told, he reportedly called it the finest display of British resolve since Trafalgar. Within 2 days the story reached the newspapers, carefully edited so no sensitive details leaked. Holmes was mentioned only as an unnamed fighter command pilot who, out of ammunition, chose to sacrifice his aircraft to shield the king. It was the kind of story Britain badly needed in September 1940, when the country stood alone and anxiety about invasion hung over everything. Despite the praise, Holmes received no medal. Awarding the Victoria Cross for a deliberate ramming risked encouraging other pilots to throw away scarce aircraft and irreplaceable training. Even the Distinguished Flying Medal stalled somewhere in the Air Ministry's paperwork. By late October, the Battle of Britain had ended and attention had shifted elsewhere. Within the RAF, ramming was quietly discouraged. It destroyed a valuable fighter and offered no guaranteed result. Later Soviet statistics, showing that survival was little better than chance, only reinforced the point. A few other pilots had collided with enemy aircraft that summer, but most were accidents under extreme pressure, not deliberate actions that could be celebrated without encouraging dangerous imitation. Townsend's famous collision with a Ju-88, for example, earned him the DFC precisely because it appeared unintentional. Holmes returned to flying almost immediately. Fighter command needed every man, and he continued operations through the final weeks of the battle. His squadron suffered heavy losses, typical of frontline units that month. Holmes survived, later shifting to ground attack work and eventually training duties. By 1945, he left the RAF with a solid, unspectacular service record. Exactly the sort of dependable career that rarely appears in history books. In peacetime, he vanished into ordinary life, working in London's financial sector. For decades, almost no one outside his family knew what he had done. The ramming incident itself faded quickly. Wartime secrecy, followed by the sheer scale of later events, meant the story slipped into obscurity. The wreckage of his Hurricane was cleared, the tobacconist's shop rebuilt, and within a year there was no visible sign of the crash. Only in the early 1990s did researchers piecing together RAF and Luftwaffe records rediscover the event. As eyewitness files resurfaced, Holmes was identified and interviewed briefly before his death in 1995 at age 80. Obituaries praised his courage and quietly questioned why he had never been formally honored. A plaque was finally placed on Ebury Bridge Road in 2005, marking the crash site. The ceremony was modest. Family members, a few residents, and RAF representatives. The marker remains today, part of the quiet patchwork of Blitz memorials Londoners walk past every day without noticing. Holmes's ramming reflects a particular kind of wartime courage, a decision made in an instant, with no certainty of survival and no expectation of reward. He saw a threat, understood that no one else could stop it, and acted. That he survived, returned to duty, and then lived the rest of his life in calm anonymity says as much about his generation as the act itself.